Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining this early this morning. We're going to start with a short introduction from Feminist, Feminist Organization in Research, and then we'll have the first panel. Please stay for lunch. We'll have pizza and vegan cheese from New Roots. There's also outside, there's a book table where you have 10% discount on feminist books. And then in the afternoon, we're having a second panel with 2 people here and 2 people online on health neglect. And unfortunately, we had to postpone the final performance that we once advertised, but we'll do that later in the semester. Probably we'll keep you up to date. Thanks for coming. We've been working on feminist rage the last 2 years with smaller encounters and then a panel last spring, exactly. And we really wanted to tackle the issue with a more interdisciplinary and intersectional approach, diving more in depth into 2 different subjects that we'll discuss today. It really means a lot to me that you all came today. We've been struggling quite a lot to organize this event because of several issues, which was making our rage even bigger, but that will never stop us. So please feel encouraged to always rage, to connect, to express, and feel inspired by today.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yeah. So, just a moment. Exactly. So, hello, everybody. My name is Louise Descaillés. I'm a member of Feminist, the Association for Feminist Research in Switzerland. Feminist is the abbreviation of Feministische Wissenschaft. And thank you for the invitation, Louise. I believe you're a member of Feminist too, so you support us actively. Thank you for this as well. Just tell me, because I can't hear if you don't hear me. So give me a sign if something doesn't work. So I'm very glad to be able to talk to you today. I'm from Geneva, but I studied in Zurich, and our association is still quite anchored in the German-speaking scientific landscape of Switzerland. So we thought it might be an opportunity to reach a French-speaking audience or a more international audience from Switzerland, because we are quite seldom in Lausanne or Geneva or Neuchâtel. So we thought this Congress would be an opportunity to present our work in Geneva, and in line with the project of this Congress, to highlight the necessity of collective work, of building strong and solidary networks of feminist resistance, also within the scientific landscape, in times of backlash, disinformation and growing anti-feminism worldwide. So these opening remarks, which is quite a flattering expression for what I'm going to do today. I'm not holding a keynote about feminist rage, unfortunately. But these remarks will just consist in a small overview of the association's history and its current projects, as well as the challenges its work faces today. We make a lot of effort to network and to build alliances, but we remain, the resources are scarce. We are all doing voluntary works, almost all. So it's good to find connections with other audiences, other institutions. I will be holding a small stall with flyers, informations, and magazines from Feminist outside, so feel free to take the materials you want. You can also buy a magazine to get to know our work and to ask me questions if you're interested in Feminist. So, Feminist is an association that has been committed for over 40 years to maintaining the visibility and dissemination of feminist research in Switzerland. It was founded by Swiss students and researchers in 1983 in the context of a joint conference on the topic of women and science. So it was a time where there were almost no female professors, notably in the humanities. So research produced by female scholars were mostly exclusively assessed by men. The founders of FemVis were academics, some with activist experience, who came from different fields such as art history or literature studies. And the aim of the FemVis association was and is still to promote feminist perspectives and the institutionalization of gender equality and gender studies in Swiss higher education, but also as an association to provide feminist researchers with a space for support and networking. As an association, the objectives of FemVis work can be divided into two phases. Firstly, a phase of institutionalization, that is the consolidation of feminist research and equality policies in higher education institutions. And secondly, a phase of continuation of this process that consisted in building bridges, that's how we coined it for today, between universities, politics, and society. So at the beginning, a major part of FemVis activities back then in the 80s consisted in writing letters of protest and statements to universities and other institutions in Switzerland, which we still do in collaboration with institutions with other working groups, to denounce the underrepresentation of women and the lack of issues related to gender in research. Back then there were also annual conferences that were held in various Swiss cities. Networking and information meetings and continuing education courses were organized, and initiatives and motions were actively supported by FemVis. And here you can see, so it's just a short historical overview, but here you can see a short list of the developments and major steps of FemVis towards its institutionalization, and also the institutions involved in this process. So just to give you an insight into the associative work back then, there are quite a lot of information, but perhaps the most important ones to mention are the first publication, 1988, was in German, the Verein Schriftenreihe FemVis. So this publication is quite of the ancestor of the magazines you can find outside, which this magazine became FemInfo, and today it is called FemFim, so German and French. It was rebranded last year, and you can find exemplars of it at the stall outside. Back then, the association also had a newsletter. And maybe important to mention, because it's a part of the work that we would like to continue, but we need to focus on university politics, so it's a bit hard, but FemVis was in the 90s, since 1985, involved in the work surrounding the country report for the World Conference on Women in Beijing, and in the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and later also in the NGO Shadow Report on the Istanbul Convention of 2011. And another notable achievement or collaboration was back then, 1997, the founding of SGGF, so Schweizerische Gesellschaft für Frauen- und Geschlechterforschung, in which FemVis still holds a seat on the board today. And this is the organ which is most active in issues related to gender studies and to underfunding, for instance. And at the end of the 90s, FemVis launched also its own website, which is still the same, femvis.ch. The year 2001 was key in terms of institutionalization. And I thought that a short overview also allows us to historicize a bit the emergence of gender studies institutes in the Swiss academic landscape. So we've just mentioned two institutions of great significance. The first chair of gender studies was founded at the University of Basel in 2001. So there was the first professorship there, and the founding of the IZFG, Interdisciplinary Center of Gender Studies in Bern, Gender Research. Along with the inter-university cooperation project Network Gender Studies Switzerland, and a national research program dedicated to equality policies in Switzerland. So these were the first steps in terms of institutionalization of associative work within scientific landscape of Switzerland. Nevertheless, despite these nominal successes, there was and still is no sign of actual equality and broad recognition of feminist scholarship. So the FemInfo magazine, which you can find today's exemplars outside, actually proved to be the constant and minimal task of the association. So the work was also very based on these regular publications. And in 2014, with a new board and a new executive director, the association's focus shifted from the institutionalization of gender studies to kind of a new strategy, one could say, to building bridges between academia, politics, and society. So information lobbying and networking were the key objectives from 2015 onwards. Anyone who supports the association's objectives could become a member of FemVis, because back then there was a restriction to female members. Today, anyone can support FemVis. Building bridges, however, is a long and demanding task for an association trying to position itself in the political and scientific landscape. The possibilities for active and high-profile association work are limited due to scarce resources. So, as I said, FemVis only has 2 paid positions, both are at 20%, and the rest of the committee is based on volunteer work. We had a big crowdfunding campaign during Corona called Save FemInfo, which indeed financially saved the magazine. And we also received funding for another project in 2022, which allowed us to create 4 editions of FemInfo together with guest editors, which was also a great possibility of networking through research. And in 2023, in order to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the association, we used this occasion to review and sharpen its position in the institutional landscape of Switzerland. So today, FemVis focuses primarily on science and university politics and works on its social media presence and communication strategies. We are part of a working group together with representatives of Swiss universities and equal opportunities and DEI offices, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. This group is called, in German, AG Hochschulpolitik, but it's bilingual. French-speaking people also take part to the meetings. It's coordinated by the Gender Campus and aims to defend gender issues and feminist approaches in higher education institutions. Just to give you an example, one of the key issues of this working group was, for instance, the coming budget cuts, known as the Budget Reduction Program, Entlastungspaket in German, planned by the federal government and their consequences for equality policies in higher education. So I won't go into budgetary details now, but in a nutshell, these cuts that are planned from next year on, I believe, are likely to have significant impact on equality policies, as they prevent the development of certain projects that promote inter-university cooperation in research, the prevention of sexual harassment and discrimination, and they also prevent measures to combat disadvantage of racialized people or people with disabilities in education, research, and teaching. In the upcoming issue of FemFem, we are launching a new section entitled Research Politics, Wissenschaftspolitik, where you can learn more about the dangers of these cuts for equality policies. So I'm also often quoting in German, but these texts are always translated in French, so the magazine is also bilingual. You may also be aware that alongside these budget cuts, the government recently selected the research projects it will support in the framework of NFS, National Research Priorities, and none of these projects stem from the humanities or social sciences. There was an open letter from the SGGF addressed to the government on this subject. And this kind of decision obviously has a direct impact on gender studies, which are already underfunded. So in light of this systemic underfunding and widespread attacks on gender studies, a discipline that is often the target of authoritarian conservative governments, it is crucial to consider existing institutions that need support and to ally with various actors in civil society. Also, I mentioned equal opportunities and inclusion offices, so these DEI. As you might know, these offices are one of the main targets of the Trump administration's fight against so-called wokeism, and the dismantling of gender studies as a scientific field just goes hand in hand with this. In this sense, promoting feminist research cannot be considered without solid and sustainable institutional policies on diversity and inclusion that follow. When gender studies as a scientific field is threatened, or approaches connected to gender studies, These threats also concern access to diverse and plural universities and greater democracy. This is why it is of urgent necessity to forge alliances and communicate these issues to students and society in general, which we also try with the magazines and with our meetings, etc. Today, the association is, as I said, mainly focused on research and university politics, but it is also trying to continue its collaborations with NGOs. It's, for instance, still a member of the Istanbul Convention Network. And by the way, one of the upcoming issues of our magazine, Fem, will focus on feminicides, because one of our members is active in the stopfemicide.ch project based in Zurich, which collects data on feminicide in Switzerland. And the next issue of Fem will focus on sustainable food systems. The title will be Food System for People, the Environment and the Climate. We will then publish a special edition of Fem on the current backlash in collaboration with a project called Aktion Reaktion, which is committed to combating attacks and disinformation about equality policies in everyday life, on social media and in politics. So you can see at the stall 2 previous editions of the magazine, and also buy it. We have a student price of 20 francs. But I would like, since I believe you're all MA students, mostly, maybe PhD, some of yours are maybe already working, but you can also write in Fem and use this magazine as a platform to publish a shorter article. We actually look for younger researchers to publish text. So if you wrote master thesis on a topic related to one of our topics, you can ask us, and we try to accompany you in an appropriate way through the redaction process. We're also nice. I mean, there is a feminist feedback culture and so on. We don't trash your texts. And just to tell you that it's of course, it's a scientific magazine, but it's also a possibility of tryout if you're interested in research, what it means to redact a text, to prepare it for publication. And if you want to support Feminist, there are different ways to do it. You can become a member of the association via the website. You can, as I say, publish an article in the journal, contact us. You can also join the board as a volunteer to contribute new ideas or support the work already underway. You can also commit to projects that are punctual. You don't need to always be there. And of course, you can talk about Femvis, following us on social media and staying in touch with us. So feel free to stop by the booth and learn more about our work. I will be happy to answer your questions, and I'm looking forward to listening to today's Congress participants. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. It's an honor to be here. I'm really, really happy to be moderating this amazing panel with our speakers today and to start the Congress before the other amazing panel this afternoon. I'm Justine Bosset. I was a master's student here in gender-based diversity. I'm currently working as a journalist, and I was part of the FemCall before. So yeah, without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. Also, is Kaziwa online?
I am.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Welcome. I will start by introducing Ilana Eloit. She's an assistant professor of gender studies at the University of Geneva. In her forthcoming book, Lesbian Trouble, Feminism, Heterosexuality, and the French Nation between the 1970 and 1981, she analyzes the French Women's Liberation Movement, or MLF, as an epistemically and politically heterosexual movement. She sheds new light on the emergence of radical lesbianism in the early 80s and recently co-edited Lesbiennes PD, Arrêtons de raser les murs, lutte et débat des mouvements lesbiens et homosexuels between 1970 and 1990. So it's the struggle and debate of lesbian and homosexual movement between 1970 and 1990. She also edited the special issue with Wittig, A Living Body of Work. And in 2025, she published an interview book with Éric Fassin called S'engager en sociologie. So thank you for being here and for giving us the chance to hear from your expertise. Kaziwa Raim-Rotzetter is an expert in intersectionality and discrimination. She specializes in the connections between racism, sexism, anti-LGBT hostility, and classism, and co-founded the Swiss-based association L'Inconfortable. Through podcasts, videos, conferences, theater workshops, and stand-up comedy, she creates many spaces that combine critical analysis, personal experience, and practical tools. Her main conviction is that discomfort can become a powerful catalyst for a social transformation. But I won't tell too much already now, and we look forward to hear more about this in the discussion. And finally, Danai Dimas is an activism coordinator and thematic lead for gender justice at the Swiss section of Amnesty International. She supports the development of advocacy and campaigning strategies on gender justice for topics such as sexualized violence, sex work, reproductive rights. She also coordinates and accompanies Amnesty volunteer groups across Switzerland as the activism coordinator, develops activism campaigns, and organizes action around key human rights issues. So welcome back in these walls. So thank you all for being here. We have a bit more than an hour, which might seem like it's a lot, but there's a lot to unpack from all the different perspectives. And I will open the floor at the end, so also take notes of your questions, and we'll come back to them hopefully at the end. So I will start with the first question, which is directed to all of you. And it's a two-sided question. Why is feminist rage so often dismissed as unproductive, irrational, or divisive? And who is allowed to be angry in public? So maybe I'll start with you, Ilana.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here with you. It's always a pleasure to be invited by students' organizations, so thank you very much. And also for making such a beautiful event on a theme that is, I think, very stimulating and also very much connected to my work, which is why I think you thought about me to respond to these questions. So to begin, I think for me, speaking about rage, I would like to bring the issue of rage as before I respond to your question, but I will get to your question. I would like to bring up the issue of rage as a research method, which might sound maybe surprising, or rage as a critical research method, against the idea that research should be neutral, that it should be precisely devoid of emotions, devoid of affects. I have to say that for me, affects were extremely important in my research. I'm really speaking about myself as a researcher right now, not as an activist, but really in my research work, affects were really central. First, it was central because I chose to work on a topic that was close to me. I chose to work on lesbian activism in the 70s because I wanted to know a story which was also my story. So those were feelings and affects of excitement, of joy about discovering a story which was also my story. But also, and this is where rage arrives in the discussion, I was very disappointed when I discovered the 1970s feminist archive, in which I thought I would find stories about lesbian liberation, lesbian visibility, lesbian emancipation, because this was the story that historians before me had told about this movement. And in fact, when I looked at this archive, I found a very different story. I found archives that for me, I found discourses that for me were very violent. I could find depictions of lesbians as masculinized, as hating men, as I'm using words that I found in the archive as stuck in the ghetto of nightclubs and bars against feminist activism, like woman, emancipated woman. There was this representation of lesbians, apolitical lesbians stuck in the bars and nightclubs, but also the idea of hypersexualized lesbians, who would also somehow threaten feminist sisterhood. So I really found all those discourses that I was like, the story I think is very different than emancipation and liberation. So I was very angry when I read this, when I looked through the archive. I was angry at 1970s feminists. I thought I would identify with them, but when I looked at these archives, I disidentified, so I was angry at them. But I was also angry at historians, feminist historians, who had never questioned this narrative, who had never seen the violence in the feminist archive, the anti-lesbian violence in the feminist archive that for me was obvious. And so the thing is that when lesbian activists refused in the 70s to be framed in these terms, when they started to politicize their own position, reactions were even more brutal. And here, Monique Wittig's archive, so Monique Wittig is a famous lesbian activist who founded the MLF, and she left the MLF for the United States in 1976. And when I found her archive, who is in the United States at Yale University, it was a very angry archive. Like, I found a very angry archive. She was always complaining in her letters about the violence of French feminists against her. And for me, the contrast was huge between Wittig's archive, that I call unhappy archive, following a concept developed by Sarah Ahmed, but which I also call an angry archive or a depressed archive. It was the contrast was huge with the feminist archive, which was much more about pleasure, joy, and solidarity, etc. So the anger I felt when I discovered how this anger had never been taken seriously into account really compelled me also to do justice in my work for these lesbian discourses and experiences within feminism. So this feeling of injustice in the archive, the anger that I felt in the archive, was very important for me to think of my work as doing some kind of reparation. And to go back to your question, and I will try to be quite short, I would just say that, and we can return to that later, but I would just say that feminist rage, for me, is dismissed because it speaks truth to power, because it is delegitimized, because it interrogates and it refuses a violence which is naturalized and which is normalized. And as Sarah Ahmed has famously said, and I know her book is, I saw the book here in the Feminist Killjoy, when you expose a problem, you become the problem. And I think this is why lesbian rage was so delegitimized in the feminist movement, because they denaturalized, they interrogated heterosexual domination within the feminist movements. So heterosexual women were not only victims of patriarchal domination, they were not only seen as resisting subjects, but also as having their own privileges as heterosexual women, and this is the one thing that they didn't want to put into question. And I think this is where the violence against lesbian activists and their critical discourses on feminism came from. So I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe now, Kaziwa, maybe you want me to repeat the question? Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. What did you say?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, so it's the same question as me.
Yeah, exactly.
You're fine. Oh, feminist rage is often dismissed as rational, divisive, productive, because anger itself is not equally legitimate for everyone in public spaces. In my experience, some people are allowed to express anger and still be perceived as reasonable, while others are immediately discredited. In many societies, the people who are most allowed to be angry, to enterprise in public, are men, because their anger is often interpreted as leadership, determination, or even as a sign that they care deeply about an issue. But I observed that the perception changes dramatically depending on who expresses that anger. For example, men who are not white or marginalized from the immigration, they are perceived, their anger, it is often interpreted as a threat, like an active threat. Their anger, it tends to reinforce pre-existing stereotypes about violence or danger coming from immigrant men. We see this particularly in the way public discourse sometimes portrays domestic violence, terrorism, if they were somehow typical, exclusive to racialized and migrant men. I would say that first. Or statistically, many of these forms of violence are also committed by white men. The difference lies in how responsibility is framed in these cases, by the media or by the people. For example, when a white man commits violence, the act is usually individualized. He is described as a troubled individual, lone wolf, an exception. But when it's a non-white man who commits a similar act, then the responsibility is often then to his entire community, whether his culture, nationality, religion, or any background. So, say that the same behavior is interpreted through very different lenses. And of course, this dynamic becomes even stronger when the person expressing anger is a woman of color. Because in that case, there are two implicit rules that are being broken at once. First, anger is socially coded as masculine. That's something I hear all the time. Angry, you act like a man, blah, blah, blah. Second, racialized people are expected to remain calm and grateful at all times in public spaces, even when they're being literally disrespected by somebody. So, of course, when racialized women express anger, their reactions are often dismissed or even pathologized. People may say they're being emotional, rational, even hormonal. That's what I hear a lot since I'm pregnant, being hormonal. Probably there's some hormone going on, but I mean, the word is gives me a lot of reason to be angry regardless of my hormones. So in other words, our anger, POC woman, is not taken seriously as a political or ethical response. It is often reduced to something personal, biological. This reaction, in my opinion, is deeply connected to a broader cultural belief shaped Western societies for centuries. It's the idea that reason is superior to emotion. And within this framework, rationality is associated with legitimacy and authority, while emotion is seen as a weakness or a loss of control. So historically, we know that emotions have been strongly associated with women. Discrediting emotion is a way of discrediting women's voice. But I think if we really want to challenge this opposition between reason and emotion, we should think that, realize that these two dimensions are not enemies. Many of our emotions, they actually emerge from our moral reasoning. When we feel anger in response to injustice, which I often do, it's because I recognize something as unfair or harmful to society or to a minority. So feminist rage is not irrational. It is often a deeply rational response to structural injustice. And I think emotion can guide our reasoning. Personally, this is why I believe strongly in my own intuition. It's not the opposite of intelligence. It is the result of accumulated experience, knowledge, perception that we process unconsciously, very quickly. But so I will end up on that. I think that ranking reason above emotion Instead of doing that, we should recognize that they're complementary. Both are necessary to understand the world and to transform it. And in many social movements, including feminist movement, emotionally, especially anger, have been powerful catalysts for change. They signal that something is wrong and that silence is no longer acceptable. So instead of dismissing feminist rage as unproductive, we might ask what it is trying to tell us about the injustices that still persist.
Many thanks. We'll get back to what you're saying right now in the next question, and it provides us a great way forward, and also links to the rage as a also research method and how you use rage as a productive or to be able to fight against an oppressive system. So thank you. And now Danai, the same question also.
Thank you so much. And maybe also first, thank you for the invitation, dear Feminist Collective. It's an honor to be here as a former member of the Feminist Collective. And it's really exciting to be sitting on the other side of this event today. So I'll try not to repeat too many of the things Ilana and Kaziwa already said, which I share deeply and feel for. And I would maybe start by saying, okay, why is feminist rage dismissed or seen as unproductive or irrational? And I would rather say, but by whom? So for me, it's if we really want to understand what is going on and why we are labeled that way and our reactions and emotions are labeled that way, it's to see, okay, but who labels it as such? And for me, it's those in positions of power and those who profit if we maintain the status quo. So it's actually those that we want to perceive us as angry and as in movement. I think feminist rage does something very, very specific. So it does name structural injustice as state violence, economic exploitation, discrimination, and different forms of human rights violations. So this label of irrational says more about the discomfort of those in power than about the anger itself. It has also been feminist rage has been a powerful source and very central to different struggles for justice in history. And I would encourage you all to not believe when people tell you otherwise. I also think maybe to answer or connect the first question with the second one of who is allowed to be angry, I would say we're living in a really intense moment right now. There are so many things happening constantly, and this political moment is really marked by a gender backlash, by rising authoritarian tendencies, and attacks on human rights on every level, and also as a concept itself. We see an attack of reproductive rights, LGBTIQA+ rights. The civil spaces are under attack, and many activists and people who stand up for justice are being criminalized. So I think we're all really allowed to be angry and to rage and to be sad and feel the whole range of emotions. And I think something that we can also take from that is that feminist rage mobilizes collectively, or it can have the power to mobilize collectively, and it does challenge rigid hierarchies, which is essential. So maybe for the second question, as Kaziwa, you already mentioned many of the points I also had noted, I would just want to maybe repeat that anger is deeply gendered, racialized, classed, and there are many stereotypes that persist and that you also mentioned, Kaziwa. So maybe as a concluding word for this question, I would say that I hope that we move beyond the framework of seeing feminist rage as something that can be dismissed or like as something that is unproductive, and that we use it with pride and organize around it all together.
Yeah. Amazing, thank you. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm always a bit stressed with those microphones to know if they're. Yeah. So now a bit more on your historical background of how has rage been used also through time, and I think it's more in relation to your research, Ilana. So I would like to ask you, how did feminist rage or lesbian rage influence movements over time? So from the French Liberation Movement to today's struggle, and how has it been expressed and used?
So I wouldn't say that in the early years of the feminist movement, rage was an effective repertoire. I didn't find rage very much in the early years of the MLF, the Women's Liberation Movement. And actually, when I did interviews with feminist activists from the 70s, they always spoke about joy, about pleasure, about solidarity, about love between women, about humor, and actually they distanced themselves from the figure, which might sound a bit surprising, but from the idea of rage, of anger. And what I came to realize was that these positive affects that they always refer to were also linked, according to me, to a certain kind of feminist subjectivity. So I do think that affect produce subjectivities. It's not that we have feminist subjects that have feelings and affect, and they express their affect and feelings in public space. I think the affects that are chosen by certain movements, by certain communities, produce a certain subject, produce a certain community. And I do think that this positive affects, the good affects of women, opposed to rage, opposed to lesbian extremism, for example, were also exclusionary because they were used to silence other women, the women who did not recognize themselves in the sisterhood, in the feminist pleasure, in the love between women. Those who did not recognize themselves in this atmosphere were very easily dismissed. And I have an example from an interview that I did with a feminist activist, again from the 70s, who told me about the story of the emergence of the first lesbian collective in the MLF. It was called Les Gouines Rouges, the Red Dykes. And she explains to me that one day they were at a cafe, all among feminists. And at some point, she says, I saw 2, 3, 4 of them, all lesbians, standing up. And they say they were leaving to have their own separate meeting, the Gouines Rouges, the Red Dykes. And I quote her, she says in the interview, "We were furious. We were already very, very, very close friends. We had already done loads of things together, and they did that to us." And I asked her, why were you furious? Because we're talking about precisely whose anger is heard, whose anger is validated, whose anger is legitimate. So she felt angry about that. So I asked her, why were you furious? And her answer is amazing. She says, because we loved them. So I think that's, and it's an interview that I had with her, like I'm not inventing anything, it really happened like that. And I think it's very interesting because it shows how feminist feelings of collective happiness, of love among women here are really used as a resource to attack lesbian minority politics. They wanted to have their own groups, to politicize their own minority positions, but here, because we love them, so love is used as a resource to delegitimize their minority politics. And so the fury that she mentions, the anger, the fury, is in fact the effect of her hegemonic resistance against the visibilization of lesbians that is happening at this cafe. But she frames it instead as the effect of her love for them. So again, I think happiness, love. I was very I think I disconstructed these affects in my work because I think, as I've said, that they produce a social reality that we should be that we should interrogate. And so I do think that it's also against this positive structure of feminist feelings, which produced a white heterosexual woman subjectivity, and which was also used to silence lesbians. That's my analysis. That lesbians reacted with what I call a negative structure of feelings. And indeed, I found different affects in the lesbian archive, different affects. Anger, rage, reluctance, sadness, refusal, escapism, withdrawal from the feminist movement. So when you're happy in a movement, you never think about those who are unhappy, who are angry, and who have left. And they have left, so you don't hear their anger, and you don't realize, you don't think about those people who didn't feel comfortable in that circle. And I do think that this kind of lesbian rage that I found in the archive can be also found in other moments in history. So for example, I can quote the Radical Lesbian Collective in 1970 in the US, who wrote, "A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion." We can also think about the American lesbian activist group, the Lesbian Avengers, and we can hear rage in the very name of the collective, and who said in the flyers, "Get mad, get even. Anger is an energy," and also whose public performances of eating fire. So they were famous because they had public performance during which they ate fire, which signified literally public rage and collective empowerment, or collective empowerment through public rage and through eating fire. And also, we can think of Adèle Haenel and the Me Too movement when she left the room of the César, when Roman Polanski got the prize for the best movie, and she said, "On se lève et on se casse." So we stand up and we leave. So I do think that rage is really about leaving the table. It's about refusing the statu quo, also refusing inclusion, because Adèle Haenel left the film industry because for her it was just impossible, I think, to transform it from within. So it's rage is an anti-assimilationist affect, I think, and it's also the affect of a radical feminist politics that refuses to play the game.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting how you portray also rage or positivism as an exclusion, or how it's paradoxal in this sense. Now we'll link what you just presented to emotions more directly, and I would like to ask Kaziwa, how, based on your professional work, how can Rage fuel not only protest but also humor, because you also do stand-up comedy, theater. How does it influence this work, and how can one use their emotion and experiences to challenge oppressive norms and systems?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So before I specialized in intersectional discrimination, I actually had a very dark sense of humor, I would say, and sometimes it could be quite problematic. So, when I started doing stand-up comedy, it was partly because I was looking for a way to bring some lightness into my work on discrimination. These kind of topics and activism in general be emotionally exhausting if you're constantly drawing from anger. So that's why I turned to humor, but at first I was really afraid of reproducing harmful form of humor. So when I discovered the idea of ching up, so it's linked to humor theories. Just a sec. Voilà. So, in stand-up comedy, one concept that really helped me find my place on stage is the distinction between punching down and punching up. So punching down refers to humor that targets already vulnerable group, so minorities, marginalized people. And the problem is that it often reinforces stereotypes. On the contrary, punching up means directing humor towards those who hold power or toward the system that produce inequality. So discovering the idea of punching up gave me a framework that felt ethically and politically current to me. Instead of making jokes at the expense of marginalized groups like most people and Purdue, I use humor to question the system, the norms, structures of power that produce inequality. So the target of the joke becomes the system itself and the people who benefit from it. And what I have noticed is that humor allows me to reach people in a very different way than it does when I do a conference or a workshop, because when I present academic data about discrimination, some people become defensive or disengaged. But when the same reality is expressed through humor, people often act and react differently. They connect emotionally. So yeah, I think humor becomes a way of opening a conversation. But also, I think it's really important to consider cultural specificity of Switzerland, because in Swiss culture, it's often considered inappropriate to show strong emotion in public or to speak in a very direct or confrontational way. So social norms tend to value moderation, politeness, and emotional restraint. And I think that's exactly why humor can become a very strategic tool in here, because it allows you to address uncomfortable topics, racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination, in a way that people are more willing to hear. Because when people laugh, their defense tends to drop. So in that sense, humor can be a form of resistance. And in my experience, humor often emerged directly and quite naturally for me from lived experiences of injustice. Because many jokes start from moments of frustration or anger, situation where the logic of discrimination becomes so absurd that it almost exposes itself. So when you turn those moments into humor, you're not minimizing the problem. On the contrary, you're literally revealing the contradiction of the system. It can highlight double standards, stereotypes, or everyday microaggression in a way that makes people recognize them more easily. So yeah, I think humor can literally shift power dynamics. Because oppressive systems often rely on authority, seriousness, control over narratives. So when marginalized people like me use humor, we are reclaiming part of that narrative power. We're showing that we're not only targets of the system, we can also be capable of analyzing them, exposing them, and challenging them in a creative way. So, yeah.
Can also be very powerful to laugh at the system that is mocking you, and you just laugh back and just you detach from it. Sometimes also it's necessary to not engage in too much rhetorical debates. Sometimes just detach also.
And I would say for me, it's not about replacing. Also, maybe the last thing is it's not about replacing my anger, because I could never. But it's just that humor becomes a way of opening a conversation, about transforming it into something creative, communicative, but that can still challenge the oppressive system while creating moments of shared understanding.
Definitely. And now a question more on how can anger or rage create links to people, because we saw from also Ilana's interviews and historical analysis that it created exclusion. How, through your work as an activist coordinator also, what does it mean to organize through anger instead of against it?
So from an organizing and mobilizing perspective, anger is often the entry point for people. So people become activists or do volunteer engagement because of the anger they feel towards injustice. So they are outraged, they see discriminatory laws, acts of violence, human rights violations, and they're like, okay, but what can I do now? And I see this as my task as activism coordinator to be like, okay, what do we do with it now? So what do you want to do? And how can we keep this energy and this rage up and transform it into concrete actions and mobilization? So I think for me, organizing through anger is recognizing that it is not a problem to fix, but it is political energy. So it's also momentum, and for me, my job is to take this momentum seriously and build some structures and support around it. So at Amnesty, we really try to channel this outrage and people who get loud and say things against what they see, and transform it or let it flow into our campaigns, advocacy, and human rights work as well. We still try to do so with a hope-based approach. We do not just want to get together. I mean, we do sometimes. We do rage as well, quite a lot. But we also want to change the framework from this is terrible to, okay, but what can we change? Where do we have leverage on a smaller picture? So really also, this can be regional, national, or then on an international level. And this approach can still start from outrage, but I think for the long term, it's more engaging to maybe transform it into something more positive. And I think it's not only the entry point, or it's not only important when talking about how people get engaged, but also how we organize our movements internally. And I think I can give you the example of Amnesty International, because a couple of years ago we decided on a global level, so this means over 160 different offices, to actually adopt the concept of feminist leadership as our guideline. And it is a process, so this does not change from one day to another. But it also means to constantly have those discussions on whose rage is loud, what hierarchies are we reproducing, who are we excluding, and to really try to organize our work around those feminist values. And this is also part of what we do right now at Amnesty Switzerland. So we are reorganizing our structures and our hierarchies. So from this really pyramid hierarchy model, we try to distribute power differently. So this does not mean that power disappears, but it is linked to roles, accountabilities, decision-making power. And so it's also a way to work more collectively, or to share and carry each other a bit more. It comes also with a lot of discussions on well-being and how do we carry each other. But for me, it's exactly those discussions and also the possibility to actually do rage and have the important conversations that keeps a movement and organizations alive. So maybe, just as a last small input, I think anger, becomes powerful when it's shared, and I think power or anger can isolate when it's it can isolate when it's singular, and when it's collective, it really can change something and make movements grow. So
Thank you. Now we're sadly almost over with the questions that I have prepared, but I have one last for all of you. So to also continue with the collectiveness of anger and how to create or to make actions from it, the question would be, how do we keep our rage alive without burning out, and what practices help us sustain collective energy? So maybe we can start with you, Ilana.
With pleasure. So I spoke earlier about this how the separation between positive affect and bad affect was used as a technique to delegitimize some subjects, and lesbians in particular, but I don't think that the separation is valid. I think it was used to delegitimize lesbian rage, but I do think that one condition to maintain the rage is to associate it with moments of pleasure, with moments of joy, and with moments of collective care. And I have an example, for example, that in my own activist trajectory, I was part of a feminist activist group which does not exist anymore. It's in France, and it was called La Barbe. I don't know if you've heard about this group. It was quite famous a few years ago, but now it doesn't exist anymore. So maybe you haven't heard of it. And La Barbe literally means the bird. And so it was a direct action group, and we used to disrupt public events with a majority of men, so which had not invited women, and so we disrupted this event, and we walked up on the stage and wearing fake beards, and we used humor. We talked about humor previously, and in that kind of activism, we used humor and irony. So we made fun of them. We congratulate them for staying among men, for resisting, for resisting the feminization of society, and it worked really well. We were also objects of violent reactions, like very, very violent reactions, but it was a pleasurable form of activism. But at the same time, we were full of rage, and the name of the activist group, La Barbe, in French, it's also an expression which means enough. We've had enough. So it's really this mix of being very, very angry and wanted to change the fact that women were never invited in those circles. Things have very much changed. Now it's more rare. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was super common to have public events with no woman invited. But to do it to have some fun doing it, because I also think that masculine domination is patriarchal domination is very violent and dangerous, and it affects our lives in very dangerous ways. But also somehow, I think it's important sometimes to think about it as ridiculous, and that's also what we did when we walked up on stage, and we made fun of them. We made fun of this dominant white bourgeois masculinity. So I think it's important to make fun of them, and also to have fun when making fun of them.
Danai?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think fun and humor does help a lot. But maybe I would like to add that we also need to normalize exhaustion and just like acknowledge that there is this collective exhaustion that we're facing and that it's okay. And I think this is also where collective care enters and becomes very important. I think care can sometimes look like going all in, being on the streets, giving everything you have, but it can also mean slowing down and taking a step back every now and then to actually regather and see, okay, where do I stand right now? And I think it's also powerful to say no sometimes, and to say, I'll take a week and then I'll be back, or longer if needed, obviously. And I think it's really about, I think I would also add that connection is just the most important part of it. I think we need each other, and we need this collective energy to remain sane, or for me this is something really important. And I think it's also sometimes reminding each other that, hey, like, maybe right now it's a lot. And I think it's also sometimes taking over tasks for others. And I think really, like Luisa Neubauer lately said on an interview, that for her, being a good activist and being like in care about each other is being a good friend, and that this is her like goal, to remain sane and not burn out in activism. And I do like this idea because I do think care is essential in this whole fights that we are having or leading. And maybe to conclude your inputs, Kaziwa.
I would say that question I haven't found a solution to yet. I would say I tend to be a very angry person as an individual in general. So I had several burnout activists, and I really tend to go on the front line, give it all, and then be really exhausted from that. And for the longest time, I didn't realize that I needed rest, that I was allowed to not be on the front line all the time. And I learned since. And now I don't do it all the time. That's why I would like suddenly disappear and rest. But the thing is, I would say that the more I worked on my emotions, the more I realized that lots of time, for me, my anger, it just covers other emotions that I'm more afraid of, like sadness or desperation or feeling of, comment dire, impuissance déjà? Not being empowered. Voilà, disempowerment. Thank you. So I think I really, really hate feeling disempowered and lacking control. So it's often easier to feel angry than sad or scared. And now that I realize that anger is often a polish I cover my other emotion with, I tend to, how do you say that? Dig deeper inside of me. And it helps me not feel angry all the time and admit that sometimes I'm not angry, I'm scared, or I'm not angry, I'm sad. And you know, it's like identifying a problem and using other tools to resolve it. It just works better. So personally, that's how I tend to not, I'm trying on not letting my anger consume me. But on the other hand, I will never let anyone make me believe that my anger isn't justified or is like intrinsically a bad thing, because as a woman and as a woman of color, I'm always being told to stay calm, not be so angry, blah blah blah. And I won't lower my voice just because it makes people uncomfortable. That is the whole reason why I called the podcast I made L'Inconfortable, because the very goal of it is to address topics that make people in society deeply uncomfortable. And I think uncomfort is a necessity in order to comment dire, remettre en question, question our beliefs and reshape our society. Voilà.
Thank you so much. Yeah, to find a way to channel the rage rather than tame it, and to create collectively actions. Now is the time to open the floor to your questions. We have exactly half an hour. So yeah, feel free to raise your hands, and I will pass around the mic.
Don't be shy.
Thank you very much to three of yours for the interesting talk. I just had a brief question that connects a bit to what has been said about exhaustion, care, and rage, which is today's topic. It's connected to something you said, Ilana, when you were describing your work at the beginning. I was very interested in the way you described affective repertoires, if I understood you correctly, and you briefly mentioned that you discovered angry archives or something that you named like this, and also depressed archives. Could you tell a few words about this? Are they connected to angry archives because anger was not enough anymore or was exhausted? Did you reflect upon depression, for instance? I was just curious about your work about depressed archives. Thank you.
So I talked about Monique Wittig's archive. Her archive for me was the archive of someone who had been very disappointed by what she found in the feminist movement. So I found anger, but I also found disappointment, bitterness. She even says herself that she left the United States because of that, and she has very strong words against her feminist former friends. She calls them oppressors. She said they pushed me. It's because of them that I had. She called her departure to the US as an exile. So there was also much sadness in this archive. So I think, and I also could see that in other kind of lesbian archive, not only Wittig's archive, but in the discourses that lesbian activists wrote in gay and lesbian magazines, not in feminist magazines, because these kind of feelings were not welcomed, obviously. That's my analysis. I don't think they were very welcome. They were more sayable in the gay and lesbian press, which was emerging in the late 70s, and where I also founded testimonies of lesbian activists who said, I did everything in the feminist movement, I gave everything I had, I fought for the right of abortion, and in the end I got nothing in return. I forgot who I was. I lost. They even said I had to identify, I had to speak as a woman, I had to feel like a woman, but the fact that I was a lesbian disappeared. And so this is where the depressive feelings were also manifested, this kind of loss of identity, because they had to identify as woman and only as woman. And it has to do also with a very specific French universalism, which I think was repeated within the feminist movement as a feminist universalism, which was based on the erasure of differences among women. Like to be feminist, you had to identify as a woman. If you identify differently, you were a separatist. You betrayed the feminist movement. All these arguments actually are already like very present today against minority activism in general, against Afrofeminism, against intersectional activism, and so there was. I think perhaps this is where depression arrives. It's really with this idea that you lose your identity as a minority because you have to identify as a woman.
So a sense of alienation through feminism.
Hi, I feel like what all of you kind of touched upon the fact that emotions were needed in the right amount. Like, for instance, Ilana and Eloit, when you talked about how people were, like it was about joy and love and loving women, and then talk about how they exclude lesbians. It's also about like the right amount of love and which kind of love. Or, when like anger was mentioned and all of that, and like who say like you are too angry or not. And it made me think about, and I just want to hear your thoughts about sanity and madness, and what can be intelligible and legitimate rage, and what gets like coined as your like madness and insanity and all of that.
To someone specific or to all of them?
Everyone.
To everyone who wants to answer.
I mean, madness was everywhere in the archive. It was really so. You know how today, like all this discourse of extremism, totalitarian activism against woke activism. Okay, this discourse, which comes mostly from the right and the far right and conservative, and like it's a conservative campaign against minority movements. All this this discursive regime of madness, irrationality. I found exactly the same terms in the ways in which radical lesbians were completely delegitimized in the early 80s. And again, I think the reason is the same as today. It's because they question domination. They question naturalized norm. In that case, it was heterosexuality as a political regime, as a regime of domination, and the only way to attack them, to delegitimize, and also Monique Wittig's thought was completely inaudible. It was completely delegitimized. And she even writes in a letter to Simone de Beauvoir, she tries to convince her to listen to what radical lesbians had to say. And she said, in Paris, they is the feminists, the straight feminists, they are the legitimates, and we are the crazies. Elles sont les légitimes, et nous sommes les folles. Donc, il y a vraiment cette idée, and also, for example, so there was a big controversy on radical lesbianism in the early 80s in France, and in an article written by those who opposed Wittig and other radical lesbians, it's the editorial of the first issue of Nouvelle Question Feminist, and they describe radical lesbians as totalitarian and terrorist. So they use these words. So it's really this language that is used to completely disqualify a thought that they did not agree with, and also which put into question their position of authority within feminism, and they wanted to keep their hegemonic position. And it's the same today with the far right, with the right wing. They're threatened by minoritarian discourses. They are threatened, and so they use the language of madness, and they reverse the relation of power. They speak about reverse racism. So it's really this inversion of a relationship of power, because relationship of dominations are threatened by these minoritarian discourses.
Danai, do you want to add something on that?
I think you said it perfectly, and I think this is really like, yeah, you managed to give a lot of background information. So I think, yeah, it's again the question of power, and the ones in power delegitimize the others who resist. So I think it's quite a usual dynamic that we see here. So yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and for everybody that has made it possible. Genuinely, I feel like it's very inspiring. And you talked about the politics of exhaustion a bit, and I was wondering, in this context of social media and over-information, where we're like constantly looking at what's happening in the world and all the atrocities, what you think about maybe these structures leading into more depression instead of anger, and maybe taking some of the anger and the energy from us, and how this hopelessness is kind of directly in contrast with anger, and whether it can be maybe bring us some hope. Just what you thought about that, maybe Kaziwa?
What is the question exactly?
I guess it's whether you think anger can bring hope for you, and whether it's kind of this like division between depression and hopelessness, and whether these platforms are trying to keep us inactive by bringing on that depression and that inaction.
Okay, yeah. Anger, and indeed bring hope. And I would say I was thinking about that because I am Kurdish, Kurdistan, Bashur, in northern Iraq, and my country, actually, women who are feeling a rage, and very brave women who are literally fighting for the country, and it's in our world. I often say if I didn't come to Switzerland, I would probably be on the field with them. But I really think that it shows that an rage in this kind of context can be really hopeful. I don't know who heard lately about the Jinjian Azadi movement. Jinjian Azadi means women, life, and freedom. And it's often led by feminist and female figures, Kurdish figures, for the liberation of all Kurds. And I think it's the perfect illustration of that hope, because I think this is the future, not just anger, but female leadership, embracing new ways of organizing ourselves in ways that have been rarely observed. And I think the key here to not just, to transform the hope, to transform the rage into hope is the dimension of being a collective. When you're alone, it's quite depressing with your rage, but when you meet other people that are like-minded and that do not dismiss your rage, but understand where it's coming from and can literally support you to transform it into something useful for society, well, that's where it changes into some kind of hope, I think. And just to finish on that, I would say that personally, the reason I got into discrimination and specialize in intersectionality is because I entered activism through the Feminist 2019. And I was really hopeful until I realized that these places were, back then at least, advocating mostly for white feminism, because racism was never debated, and whenever we would bring it up, it was dismissed. Secondary, and that's the whole reason why Faiza and I are creating the podcast L'Inconfortable and the Association Antiraciste L'Inconfortable, precisely because we felt kind of enraged and betrayed that we were not seen as both women and people of color, but just, something that isn't, the mix of it. So we needed a space where our rage would be heard, and that was the podcast. I think that's also a sign of rage transforming into hope.
Does someone from the other speaker want to add to this? If not, we'll go to the next question.
Maybe just something small. I think also what you mentioned about the information overflow and social media and how many informations and terrible things we constantly see. Those are conversations that I have a lot with different groups of activists. And I think it's super important to talk about this overflow and also what it does with your energy and what you're it tires. And I think something that really helps is acknowledging that you can't know everything, you can't be on top of everything, and also that social media is not the only source of information. And I think this is something that I want to stress over and over. Yes, you can get information from social media, but do pick one or two topics and really get informed through media or research and broaden your sources, please. And I think this can also really help to say, okay, I'm scrolling, I have those moments where I indulge, where I get into all those loops, but then also I take moments or time out of my days, my weeks, my months, to just really focus on one thing that I want to learn more about and engage in a more direct way. So I think this is something that I maybe would want to answer to this question as well.
Thank you so much for the super interesting conversation. I think I have two questions, maybe they're kind of speaking to each other, but I would love to hear you talking about how rage has evolved over time for you in your respective environments, how rage kind of manifested differently, maybe in 5 years today. How do you kind of channel that rage over the years? And my second question is more of I wonder if you had any reflections around who can be enraged in different time and places, and if you've seen any, I don't know, correlation between rage and class. Yeah, so it's kind of a lot at once.
To start.
Well, it's a good question. How rage has evolved for me. I think I was very angry when I became a feminist, and when perhaps somehow my research was also full of anger, but I think it was also work of therapy. Doing research as a therapy, maybe for me. Maybe not the best therapy, but a therapy for sure. I would say that it's just the world we're living in, for me, is just so inconceivable. The things that are happening now were so inconceivable even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We thought we were living in the worst moment 10 years ago, and now it's so sometimes I feel like I don't even have energy to be angry anymore, and I feel we talked about hopelessness, and really now it's just yes. Sometimes I feel like I wish I wish I had the energy to be more angry, but I feel more hopeless. Maybe you want to add something?
Yes, I mean, it's hard for me to say how rage has evolved outside from I have not that much of experience. I can't say how the 70s were regarding to rage because I was not born yet. So I think for me what I see is that obviously there are different places and different times, and rage always has a different positionment. So there are contexts where it's more accepted, and as we also already mentioned, rage from certain groups of people is more accepted than from others. And I think for me, it's also rage is one of many emotions that I feel in my work, or also my activism that I do, besides my work with Amnesty. And I think at the end, it's just about how you handle those emotions. And really, I think for me, it's again, I'm really thankful that there is the spaces where I can rage and the spaces where I can connect and talk about those things, which is also not a given anymore, in our current political situation. So there are more and more contexts where you can't actually share those feelings and emotions loud anymore, or you have to do so in, hidden and really in private. And I think, I mean, you also asked how rage becomes, or like also if it's a matter of class, right? And I think obviously it is. Like all those concepts are racialized, they are class, they are like there's so many different systems of oppression that have an impact on rage and who is allowed to express their emotions. Yeah, I don't know, Kaziwa, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think whether it's class, gender, sexuality, race, or other identities, I think it's the more you're ostracized, the less you have, like, the less your emotions, especially rage, in society. So that's exactly the reason why I specialize in intersectionality, because it studies the way that people who are on the crossroad, at a crossroad where more than one of the aspects of their identity belongs to an oppressed minority. So it can be gender, race, class, blah, blah, blah. And that means that you're gonna actually be the target of not just multiple discrimination, but intersectional discrimination. And of course that class will also be a parameter, on which people will rely to dismiss your anger and your access to emotions in general. For example, I see it in the way that when you're from lower class, humor is often judged as being vulgar or, not in its place. And I think it's also something to consider in the spaces that we enter, as not to, misjudge some kind of humor as vulgar only because it comes from lower class people. And, especially in university and intellectual spaces like here. Voilà.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question that touches upon two of the different threads that I think you've mentioned. One was the importance of being able to channel the rage as energy. So really interested in this importance aspect of the channeling of that. And the second one that you mentioned was essentially looking at how there is fragmentation and division within the feminist community as well. And so this question of care as, and so I wondered if these both sort of explore a little bit of the risks or the shadow side of rage. So particularly now where it's so difficult to see how what we invest our energy in can actually have that material change. So then how do we make sure that that rage is nevertheless not, I don't want to say bleeding over, but it can, how do we ensure that that channeling still occurs? And I guess here looking at how we do have hypercritical positions within the feminist movement, where the feminist shaming, if you will, or blaming in certain ways, that does come up, I think, from that same energy, right, where there is frustration and a need to change things. And so I was just curious to hear from any of you around how do we have that sort of cultivation, obviously, of care, perhaps as another side within the community, recognising that when we do spend so much time channeling our emotions in a way that's productive in terms of the collective action and the resistance, that it can become the default way in which we apply or channel our energy. So interested in those dimensions of care, and also what do we do when obviously that channeling is within the community, is needed within the community as well.
I don't have a response. I think it's a very important remark and comment, and I agree with what you said. I think the risk is because we feel so powerless. We feel like we have no agency. We cannot change. Like, for example, something that I liked about the feminist archive. Like I criticized it a lot, but something that I liked in the feminist archive was this certainty that they were going to change the world. The certainty that capitalism would fall, that patriarchy would fall. They were certain that there was a positive future. And this has I think this has completely disappeared. We are in a completely different, what we would call a regime of historicity. We don't see the future, and we don't see a good future. So I think maybe one of the consequences of that, one of the risks, is to redirect our rage, our energy, our agency towards those who are the closest to us. And it can be a mistake, I think. Yeah, maybe to also, the question that was asked before, but the rage is still running into my head about how I've evolved with my own rage. But I think it's very tiring to be angry all the time. And I've also learned how to accept. Like, I have a family who couldn't be more opposed on the level of ideas to my own ideas. And but at some point, it was impossible for me to being angry all the time, impossible to fight all the time. It wouldn't change anything, and impossible to cut ties. So learning how to live with close people with whom you very much disagree. I think for me that was an apprentissage, learning. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy that you said that you can't answer the question, because I can't answer it either. I think for me it's also a lot about taking one step after another, and maybe keeping some morals or some pillars that we want to work towards as a line or as a goal in mind, and then really seeing, okay, what can we do around us? How do we support each other? How do we rage together? How do we move together? How do we create actions? How do we ensure that, like, we educate ourselves and everything? And I think also within movements, we still need to acknowledge that we're all individual people with individual perspectives, ideas, wishes, like luggage that we come with. And I think I would assume that no movement in history has only been united. I don't think that there were groups that always had the exact same ideas and expectations. So I think obviously those times that we're living now make it harder to unite, or because there's so many different opinions that also exist next to each other. But I really think it's centering or like focusing again on what we share and how we support the initiatives that we see as great and as important. Yeah.
For my part, I would say that obviously I don't have an answer, but it's something I'm thinking about a lot since being pregnant, child. Think about how to teach this child to manage its their emotions, and I think I will have a space where I will really enjoy caring for somebody in a way that I never had to before, and teaching the child to manage their emotion. And by managing emotions, I don't mean not feeling them or reframing them all the time. It's more about being there for this new person to experience these emotions and all kinds of aspects. And I think I will learn a great deal about emotions, care, and anger. And I really, really want to be a space for this child where when they're feeling angry, they don't have to hide it. And if the reason they're angry is legitimate, which it will probably be often, I would like to validate this anger, because I really want our perspective in general to change on anger, because as I've noticed, I don't know if it's especially in Switzerland or whatever, but being angry is seen as a very negative emotions in general, and I don't think it should be seen as such because of everything we've seen today. Anger can be a very wonderful tool for social empowerment and change, and as such, it should be cared for. Voilà.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I think we're running out of time now, but I think one of the big learning I get from today is that we're all angry. We're also all tired. We can be also hopeless. It's a sad period we live in, but it's also amazing to see all these energies coming together and how we can complement each other, also from learning about how people raged before, how people rage now, and how we can use other tools and channel the rage through powerful media that can talk to many different people, because we're all individuals, but we can come together, and yeah, that's the beauty of it. And I think I'm gonna take that with me today. So now we will meet for a lunch break. I will invite Louise to present everything again. I will thank also Louise and all the FemCool for organizing this panel today and the whole Congress. I think they all deserve a round of applause. But also, of course, for taking the time today, Kaziwa, Ilana, and Danai, they also deserve a very warm applause. Yeah, and if you want to do some therapy through research, you can also still ask Louise question after at the booth right there. Yeah, so I will invite you, Louise.
Yeah, thank you all for being here today and speaking and sharing your insights. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank just everyone who was part in organizing this Congress. Like, we have a lot of other initiatives from the Institute who helped out, and some other sponsors. Also, thank you, Louise from Feminist, to be present today. I would also really thank the former FemCool members, two here on stage, but also two that I'm seeing here. This work is not possible without the community working together and supporting each other. I also hope that now during the lunch break, which the pizzas will be arriving soon, so the 5 minutes that we're still waiting, I hope you can check out the book table. Also, we're selling Palestine Cokes for $2.50 to help us organize and pay for this Congress. To have a place and a space to exchange. There are some questions that weren't asked yet, but maybe have that space to ask and discuss, connect, and then be here again at 1:30 for the second panel. Thank you.